So for the presentation today, I'm going to talk first about a little more about interculturality. And as you can see, I keep going a bit deeper and deeper into different aspects. So I'm going to look a little more at the social sciences and the missiology. Then we're going to go back to prophetic dialogue, which is a core part of two of our general chapters. And then we're going to link that prophetic dialogue with interculturality. So that's linking three succeeding general chapters together. In that way, I'm going to talk again a little bit of our anthropology tradition, but a little different from what I talked about this morning. Again, just trying to make the circle and come back to that. And then we'll look to see what the implications are in that regards. At the end, we will have our Q&A. And just to let you know ahead of time that Steve is going to have to leave after a few minutes because of another commitment he has on this end. But Steve will be back tomorrow. He'll be the one giving the presentation tomorrow morning. So he will be back, but he has another commitment that he has to attend to also today. Okay. So general chapters. So in our 2000 and 2006, we had the themes of prophetic dialogue. One was in terms of ad extra, in terms of our ministry, one in terms of what does that mean within ourselves. The following chapter in 2012 of interculturality was our 2012, and we looked at both the ad extra and ad intra. So these are these three general chapters together, and I realize that sometimes general chapters may seem like something far off, and how does it really impact us? But I encourage you to continue to reflect on this if you can. I've had the opportunity to be more engaged at different levels with this, and I think there's a lot of richness there, but I understand that, how does it connect with my reality? And maybe today's sharing session will help in that regards. To show the parallel, the SSPS also, their first General Assembly of Provincials in 1987 already talked about intercultural living as a non-negotiable for the SSPS. In 2008, their general chapter was, we are intercultural and interconnected communities, not for its own sake, but in and for mission. We are challenged to move from dominance to mutuality, from adaptation to integration. This is from their 2008. So you can see that theirs was 2008, 2012, we did the interculturality. So there's a lot of parallels between our two congregations. And then the 14th general chapter, widening the circle of communion, creation, poor, marginalized others, and within the congregation. That was the SSPSs. So just in terms of general chapters, the parallel between there. So this is a quote that I've already used once from Bob Casella, just as a reminder, focus, the meaning of interculturality beyond mere coexistence, to emphasize and make explicit the essential mutuality of the process of cultural interaction on both the personal and social levels. That mutuality again. And we know in mutuality, there's seeds and weeds in both gardens. So that's also part of the picture. Mutuality does not mean accepting everything from our culture or the culture of the other. Then from Van Tong Nguyen, an article he had in Verbum, beyond cross-cultural, one-directional, to mutual, multidimensional exchange and enrichment. This is what we've been talking about these last couple of days. Now it's interesting that actually the social sciences were actually talking about this before we were in terms of theology, in terms of missiology. And they talked about it in terms of three different areas. So this is the social sciences perspective. John Kirby was very involved in this study when we began this back in 2012 in that initial group of people, of resource people for interculturality. Thank you, John, for all your work on this in that regards. So the first was moving from ethnocentrism to what I call interculturality. Now, Bennett, who developed this, he talks about it in terms of ethnocentrism to ethno-relativism. So that's his term. So you'll see that on that little chart. And he has 6 stages by which we can mark how do we move in terms of our intercultural sensitivity. And he has a tool that we use, and that helped us in our early years in 2012, 2013. We began using this tool. We use it with our general council. We use it with some new provincials. This was something that we were looking for tools. What tools can we get from the social sciences? So this is one that we that we used. And John Kirby, again, did a lot of study in this area. Michael Ringovich, he's a missionary anthropologist, a Protestant. He's worked with the SVDs in Papua New Guinea. He gave a talk in Poland some years ago to the SVDs there as well. Ringovich says, each culture can be understood and appreciated only in its own context. This is what we've been saying. So moving away from ethnocentrism to interculturality. And there are these 6 stages. This was developed by Milton Bennett. And he has a lot more material on this. If anybody wants more, you can ask John. John actually has all this more and more information on this whole process. So again, we were looking for what kind of tools have already been created that we can use to help us as missionaries to understand and see where we're at in terms and where we need to grow. So that's one area. The second area is moving from colonialism to decoloniality or post-colonialism. Mignolo, who is an author who writes on this, the differences are not cast in terms of values of plus and minus degrees of humanity. Because colonialism did that. They said these people are less human, or in some cases, in terms of enslaved peoples, they're not even humans, they're only chattel. Right? And S.M. Michael, another SPD, whom many of you may know, anthropologist and missiologist in India, very involved in the interculturality work. We need to move beyond the colonial understanding of Christian mission. So colonialism was not just in governments, it also impacted how mission was done as well. So the social sciences are out there, and they're also saying we got to break out of ethnocentrism and colonialism and the post-colonialism, which economically still continues today. The third area the social sciences looked at was globalization. To move from globalization, which they are defining as something negative, or at least they're focusing on the negative aspects. And the negative aspects are a smothering metaculture. And I mentioned some of this yesterday. And somebody asked a question about social media, and then we talked in terms of the globalization piece in that way. So globalization, the negative sides is a smothering metaculture. In other words, this overall world culture, but what happens to the local economies and the local people? The other extreme under globalization is a very strong fundamentalism that can occur. So these are the two extremes. So global, they also were saying, how do we move away from that to mutual respect and power among cultures? So these are the social sciences. Now, the people in business and universities, they're interested in this topic too. They were actually interested because of, international trade and that. So the social sciences highlight the potential of true interculturality for contributing to the creation of a world in which individuals, communities, and nations interact in a more appropriate and mutually enhancing fashion. What you see here is the social sciences are taking it beyond individuals and communities to nations. Now we have talked about nationality, but of course they're extending it. So this is the work that the social sciences have been doing. And John Kirby and myself and those of us who were members back in 2012, 2013, we studied what the social sciences were doing so we could say, what kind of tools can we use to help us? And where their goals might have been for economic gain, ours is we said, now we're aiming towards what does that mean for the reign of God? But how can this help us to understand the cultural aspects? We're not talking about the gospel values here. That will come in just a moment. So the missiological and theological understanding of interculturality is, with Vatican II, the shift from the old heroic paternalistic model mission, reaching down to save and help another person, paternalism, to a model of humility and mutuality, developing a reciprocal relationship out of respect for how God is already present in the other. So moving around that idea of helping, what used to be said, the great white man's burden, it's crazy stuff like that. Also, what we find is a positive assessment of all cultures. Every culture contains both the seeds of the word and also the weeds, the elements contrary to the reign of God. And we've talked about that already. True intercultural interaction, quote, is crucial for mutual enrichment and for the recognition of the continual call to conversion for all. So this are both and. We both have to continue in both ways. This is related to other things shifting in terms of mission. Instead of saying from the west to the rest that all the missionaries were coming out of Europe, North America, and Australia, but now mission on 6 continents. You know, God's mission is not defined geographically. Church is missionary by nature. Every local church is sending and mission receiving. Okay. And then there's also been a movement, rather than talking in terms of ad gentes to the nations, to inter gentes among the nations. So in other words, simply not a one directional, but how are we all enriched and challenged? I'm not saying we have to get rid of the word ad gentes, but the meaning is not seen as one directional and as you go from one superior to an inferior position. And that's what all this interculturality. And what I have found in this study, the work that I've done in these last 8 years or 10 years, is to see that there's complementarity of the social sciences and the missiology together. We can learn something from the social sciences and we connect it with our missiology. I think that's really a key. Now in the second part, we're moving towards prophetic dialogue. I realize some of you are much more familiar with this already, but again, I'm going to take this and put it in a dialogue, and to bring that in conversation together with the interculturality. So in our 15th general chapter, the way I understand what happened at that chapter in 2000 is that the Asian SVDs who came there, many of them came from a perspective that mission as dialogue. And this was coming from the Federation of Asian Bishops' Conferences, which are saying we need to dialogue with the poor, with other cultures and other religions. So this is something that was coming out of both the Asian Bishops' Conferences, out of the Asian Church, but also from our SVDs who are either working there and or from there. Latin Americans, for that 2000 chapter, were coming more from the perspective of the prophecy aspect. In other words, the reaching out to the poor, preferential option for the poor, a prophetic stance against systems and for the sake of the poor. And again, this came out of the Federation, from the Bishops' Conferences, CELAM, the Bishops' Conferences of Latin America, who were also talking about this. So the missionaries are not making this up on their own. It was the reflection and the theology coming out of the church of those two areas. So we had missionaries coming. Some were focused more on the dialogue aspect, Latin Americans, for example, and others among more in prophecy. What happened during that chapter, this was not arranged ahead of time, but what ended up coming out was this idea of prophetic dialogue. Mission that is both prophetic and dialogical. And I began to talk about this a bit yesterday. I forget who I was talking to, somebody, and we got talking about this. So taken from our general chapter of 2000, it is in dialogue that we are able to recognize the signs of Christ's presence and working of the Spirit. This is also related to Redemptoris Missio of John Paul II and all people. And together with our dialogue partners, we hope to hear the voice of the Spirit of God calling us forward, transformation. In this way, our dialogue can be called prophetic, to something new. Steve Evans and I, we used this idea of prophetic dialogue in the book that we did on conscience and context. And we used it as a way of seeing connecting a synthesis or a creative tension of the 3 basic Catholic mission theologies and practices today. Participation in Missio Dei, liberating service of the reign of God, and proclamation of Jesus Christ as universal Savior, Christocentric. This is something that Steve and I did with this book, and some of you would be familiar with this already. So we use it in a theological way. However, we began to realize that even though it was very helpful for us to see that these 3 theologies together they strengthen the importance of the dialogue of how God is already present, but they also stand behind the prophetic element of proclaiming the word of God as it is and speaking against those things that are contrary to the reign of God. So we saw it in terms of theology. But then very quickly we said, it's not just theology, it's practice. This is what's behind us when the work we do, the ministry we do. In what way is it prophetic? In what way is it dialogical? Sort of that dance between the two. So later on, we wrote that book in 2004. 7 years later, we wrote this other book, Prophetic Dialogue, in which in the 7 years after we wrote the first one, we had many discussions. I would go to Asia. When I was in Asia with Asian missionaries and I talked about prophetic dialogue, they'd say, dialogue, yes, but where's the prophecy? And they'd say, prophecy means proselytism, forcing people to be baptized. They said, no, prophecy is not about proselytism. Prophecy is we stand ourselves for who the word of God is, even with other people of other religions. Talking to Latin Americans, they'd say prophetic dialogue, and they'd say, prophecy, yes, speaking on behalf of the poor, but how can you dialogue with unjust systems? Yeah. So after many conversations, and not just with SVDs, not just with Catholics, we had these conversations with Protestants, conciliar Protestants, evangelicals, Pentecostals, lots of different people. Other people are looking, they're looking at this too. So then we came out with this book in 2011 to develop this more. So I'm just going to give a little bit. This is just a snapshot. Mission as dialogue, and then mission as prophecy, and then we bring the two together. So they're like two sides of the coin. And we believe that we need to have both. Sometimes we might need to be more dialogical. Sometimes we might have to be more prophetic. Okay. So dialogue, a major shift from the pre-Vatican II. Now we see that there's a two-way exchange of gifts. So we're talking of dialogue now between missionaries and the people among whom they work. Mission is not just a matter of doing things for people. It is first of all a matter of being with people, of listening and sharing with them. Okay? So theology and practice together, they must go together. Doing and being, what we do and who we are. Paul wrote in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, we were gentle among you like a nurse tenderly caring for her own children. That's that strong sense of being with people. We are determined to share with you not only the gospel of God, but also our own selves, because you have become very dear to us. Okay? You're going to see that there's a deep spirituality behind that statement. What does that take to care with people that much? The love, as mentioned yesterday. Then we move, so theology, practice, and then we began to think, but we have to think of this as a spirituality as well. It's not just theology, it's not just action, it has to be who we are, our spirituality. Pope Paul VI, he wrote this before the end of Vatican II in '64. It seems to us that the sort of relationship for the church to establish with the world should be more in the nature of dialogue. This is representing the major shift in Vatican II. Later on, the document comes out in '91. Further developments, mission, quote, always implies a certain sensitivity to the social, cultural, religious, and political aspects of the situation. This is not just in Papua New Guinea and in Asia and Africa, it's every place around the world. And so attentiveness to the signs of the time through which the Spirit of God is speaking, teaching, and guiding. Such sensitivity and attentiveness are developed through a spirituality of dialogue. So now we're talking more. And it's a spirituality that we can be discerning and looking and seeing and understanding. So just as God is dialogical in God's self, the three persons in the one Trinity, the immanent Trinity, to use a theological term, so the church needs to learn from the world, its cultures, its religions. We talked about the flesh, The word becoming flesh, the whole of creation, God's unfathomable riches. This is both within the SVD and SSBS intercultural living and within our mission work. So ad intra and ad extra. I have an image here of a Native American image of the Trinity. our Trinitarian foundations, which we talked about this morning. What do we do? What's an image of this dialogue? And it's an image I used already the other day. I'm bringing it back. We take off our shoes out of respect. Whose world we are entering into, that God's presence is already there. This is the dialogical. This is the spirituality. What does it mean to take off our shoes? The humility that's required. There's various images of that dialogue, being a treasure hunter, looking for how God is already present so that we all can be enriched, that we are a guest in somebody else's house. We don't come in and tell them what color to paint their walls. We enter in. Again, we can accompany them. We can be aware of their hospitality. We accept their hospitality as a guest, not as a master in their house. And we are a stranger. And of course, being a stranger can feel awkward, but that opens up the door. When we're a stranger, that means we step back and say, I know this is not my world. Tell me about yours. That's the dialogical. Other aspect now is the other side of the coin. So the prophecy, now we look the dialogue, now we look at mission as prophecy. Mission is and must be prophetic because God's inner nature is also prophetic. God is calling us to something new. Yesterday, I talked about 3 movements in that conversion process, The egoism, ethnocentrism, and consumerism. It's all a part of that. This is the prophetic element now, that transformation. The Spirit anoints prophets to speak God's words faithfully, to bring good news to the oppressed, healing to those who are discouraged, liberty to the captives, release the prisoners, comfort to those who mourn, a condemnation to those who have betrayed the covenant, coming from Isaiah 61. Now, as I say this, I have a line in bold there saying, prophetic mission is not forceful proselytism. It's not people being forced. And again, that's because of some of the reactions I've gotten from some people. When I talk about prophecy, they mean, oh, you're going to cram it down our throats again. Yeah. Jesus is a eschatological prophet. In other words, speaking about the breaking in of the reign of God. He was a prophet about that reign of God. And Paul, also in 1 Thessalonians, drew courage from our God to speak the truth to you, the gospel of God. So this is the prophetic element. We do speak that truth in that regard. I think this is something we were talking about with Peter yesterday, the importance that we do need to speak that gospel of God. And later also in Romans, Peter saying, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. Okay, this is the prophetic element. What is the nature of prophecy? Prophecy is rooted in dialogue. We have to be people who listen to God's word. Again, the depth of that spirituality, to listen to God's word, discern how God is present in the signs of the times before we speak, attentive to people and their context. Prophecy is annunciation. This is something that was rather an eye-opening thing for me about 10 years ago, or more than that now, maybe 12 years ago, to see prophecy as annunciation. How do we announce how God is present and people don't see it? And how do we announce the good news of hope? How much is that needed today in the midst of the coronavirus and all the financial situations? The word of hope is a prophetic word, because everyone else is saying doom and gloom. Where is God's presence and God's plan that is not seen? We think of that image of the dry bones. And a message or action of good news and hope. And this annunciation can be done with and without words, with and without words. You see in this image on the upper right, I don't know how well you can see it, we have Mother Teresa at the grave of Gandhi. 2 very important figures in terms of how did they, with and without words, of nonviolence, how did they speak on behalf of the reign of God. The other aspect of prophecy is denunciation, denouncing those things with and without words that are injustice, a narrow understanding of religion. You know, Mother Teresa seeing people dying in the gutters. How do we do that? Denunciation. Okay. Here I have a picture of an invitation to a vow ceremony. Our vows, our 3 vows, are countercultural. They should be prophetic. What do we say in terms of goods and poverty, obedience to God's will through our superiors and to our community, and chastity, that abounding love, self-giving love going out to all people? To understand our vows in terms of interculturality. How does that reach out to others? Yeah. So this idea is theology, practice, and a deep spirituality. That must be the grounding. The image I use here is that every garden needs weeding. So every garden needs to have things that pulled out that are contrary to God's reign. This is the prophetic element, and also being able to see how God is present. They can't see it. Various images of the mission of prophecy. A teacher is someone who has something to teach. However, they also can learn from their students. A storyteller, telling the story of Jesus and the church in deeper meaning. This is a prophetic word. We hear the parables. Those are prophetic words to us. The challenge. And being a trail guide, learning how the people in prophecy help people to read, to know the maps. That Christians follow the way. As we know, the way was how Christians, that was how Christianity was referred to at the beginning. These are images of finding our way, the right way, and not the wrong way. Okay, we talked about dialogue and prophecy. Now, how do we bring those two together? The Asian bishops, who soon after Vatican II said mission is about dialogue with the poor and cultures and religions. But after about 15 years or so, after Vatican II, 15, 20 years, they began to say, yes, dialogue, but dialogue is not enough. We dialogue with the poor, but we also speak out against what keeps the poor that way. Prophetic dialogue. We dialogue with all cultures, but we also critique those aspects of culture that are contrary to the reign of God. Prophetic dialogue. We dialogue with other religions, and we also maintain the conviction that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. There's two together. Prophetic dialogue. David Bosch, South African missiologist, he died in '91, car crash. He spoke of mission as bold humility or humble boldness. Steve and I see this as a parallel to the idea of prophetic dialogue. Boldness, that's the prophecy. And the boldness is not based on our own, who we are, but it's who God is, that good news, the truth. The dialogue is that humility. We don't know how God is working in other ways. Bold humility or humble boldness. We know only in part, we don't know everything, but we do know something about who Jesus is and what God is offering. We know something about that, and that's what we have to share. So how do we bring these two together, interculturality and prophetic dialogue? I'm sorry, this might be a bit heavy, I don't know, but I just invite you, just pick up what you can. And later on, this is being recorded, and Dung will be sharing this with John, and he'll be able to make it available if people want to look at it again. How do we bring these two together now? Prophetic dialogue shaping interculturality. So the prophetic dialogue provides a theology, a Trinitarian theology, dialogical, a positive attitude to culture, but denouncing and announcing to every culture as well. So I think it offers a very solid theology for the interculturality. Social sciences don't do that. God bless them. It's also in terms of practice. Prophetic dialogue is a practice, promoting mutual enrichment and critique, and avoiding claims of cultural superiority, dominance, racism, ethnocentrism, whether it's a global power or individuals or groups. And prophetic dialogue brings a spirituality, discernment of God's spirit, both humility and boldness, that balance between the two. What is the interculturality? What does that bring to the prophetic dialogue? It helps us in understanding the content. How do we understand the context of where we go? Whether it's in terms of ethnocentrism and how that impacts us, in terms of colonialism, in terms of globalization. And these are questions that when I move and talk to other people around the world, these are questions that people are asking. And so we need to be smart missionaries. We need to be able to understand the context. We can't be naive about economics. We can't be, how do we understand this better? And interculturality gives us some tools that we can use to help us. How do we deal with conflict resolution? How do we do reconciliation? There's some strategies. There's also spirituality, but they can help us in that way. And here I list some of the various forms of mission that I talk about. These are some of the different aspects: witness and proclamation, liturgy, prayer, contemplation, justice, JPIC, interreligious secular dialogue. These are all aspects of mission, and interculturality can help us in each of these to know how to do this. Jesus is the answer, but what is the question? How do we know what the question is? And they provide us tools for our ad intra life as well, our SPD life. I already talked about this image of the entering someone else's garden. We already talked about that. This is just a reminder about that. Here I have an image of our SSBS sisters, the ad intra. And on the right is a picture of one of our SPD, John, who is working in Papua New Guinea, ad extra. A fourth point here is now to move back to this Anthropos tradition, which I touched upon already earlier today, and I'm just bringing it back into the picture. So we already talked about the importance of Wilhelm Schmidt and Arnold Janssen for the Institute and the Journal, the impact of the importance of studying culture for missionaries, for anatomists to become a Chinese. And then I mentioned Mother Teresa Messner, the first SSBS Superior General. She was an amazing woman during World War I. This is what she wrote during the war. If we wish to become missionary sisters, we have to adjust to the customs and usages of foreign peoples. This is in our ministry. This is what we have to do. This is written at the beginning of the 20th century. And then later on, after the end of World War I, and you remember for the sisters and for the SVDs, we had members who were on opposite sides of the battle lines. We certainly had that experience at Techni, and this was around the world. So you got members whose nations are killing each other's people. What did she write at that time, December 1918? She wrote, "Whoever we may be, whether German, Dutch, Austrians, British, Russians, or Americans, we, dear sisters, are all children of the one great family of God." This is a very small clip. She has some very unbelievable writings that I've had the opportunity to read of talking about. And she says, don't take it out on the people. Don't take it out on the fellow sisters. And this is very practical. And this requires a deep spirituality. In terms of our Anthropos tradition, which I already talked about this morning, again, just to weave it back into us. And this is a quote that I had this morning from Tony Pernia already. Our Anthropos tradition is a way of doing mission that considers appreciation of people's culture as a necessary precondition for genuine evangelization. Missionaries ready not just to change people, but to change oneself. Again, the mutuality, enrichment and change by all. Ad extra in our mission, ad intra within. SM Michael from India, SVD, says, will the present SVD generation understand the pioneering work of the Anthropos tradition and get energized to be creative in today's mission. How do we keep this going? Of course, John is also a member of the Anthropos Institute along with myself. There's about 40 of us around the world now. But again, how do we as all SVDs embrace this? The picture here is of Louis Lesbitek. He was one of the members, a significant, important person in the Anthropos tradition and Anthropos Institute. I actually I had a chair of the Lesbitek chair at CTU now. What are the implications of this? Bringing together interculturality and prophetic dialogue moves beyond a mere instrumentalist understanding of the relationship of the social sciences and mission. In other words, we're not just using the social sciences as a tool, but we really need to say what's being said here. What can we understand from this? In other words, we can't just pull it off the shelf and start using it without knowing what we're doing. I mean, that's for anything, of course, including the Bible. We need to understand what it's about. Both of them, I think, are grounded in the Trinitarian theology. That Trinitarian theology that, from God back to God, the diversity within the Trinity, that call to unity and diversity, appreciation of God's presence already, but calling all to that transformation in that way. It's theory, theology, it's practice on the ground, it's reality, and it's spirituality. Both prophetic dialogue and interculturality see the need for a process of transformation and conversion of perspectives and attitudes. The social scientists know this too. That's what they're talking about. John Kirby, writing about this at one of his articles, he talked about it as a cross-cultural conversion. John Pryor in Indonesia said intercultural conversion. I don't care what word you use, but we're all talking about the need, The need for this transformation, that spirituality. That's why we have a retreat on this. This is not just a course on mission theology. This is what we are. I'm very convinced of the importance of this for our mission, for our missionary spirituality. To be humble, to be bold, to be dialogical, to be prophetic. In conclusion, prophetic dialogue contributes theology, practice, and spirituality. That's our spirituality and our theology, practice, and spirituality from our chapters, 2000, 2008, 2006. Interculturality gives us content, methodology, and training. It gives us some practical tools for what we can use. Social analysis. The two belong together. They can enrich and complement each other. So bringing these two together. In my own work in Papua New Guinea, this was very important for me. I have my own experience there when I went to New Guinea, and my own study that I had done before going. I didn't do much, but I did some study in anthropology. Later, I did further studies in linguistics. And when I was doing missionary work in Papua New Guinea, I was able to use what I knew from the social sciences, what I read from the anthropologists. It helped me to understand what was going on in Papua New Guinea at that time, things that I wouldn't have had a clue. And then with that, now to say, what does this have to do with being a Christian in today's world? What does this have to do with traditional religions? It was something I found they were so complementary for each other. And again, that's Papua New Guinea. This applies to every place we are. How do we understand our context, what's going on, and our own rich spirituality? And to be in touch with the source of creativity, the Spirit. Just like the Spirit led those early women and men disciples of Jesus through Acts of the Apostles, that same Spirit accompanies us to face the challenges today. What does this mean for us in the Western province today? What does this mean for us in terms of that? The SVDs in general.